Hey everybody, welcome to Apocalypse Rising. Thanks for tuning in. Got a little time at work here. I think I'll probably just call it a day. So I decided to make a video, and I'm going to continue talking about climate change, even though it won't be too far off here until I'm chomping at the bit to talk about politics and the economy and that kind of stuff. But we'll continue with climate change. And I actually got quite a few new subscribers. So I'd like to welcome everybody and say thanks for subscribing and commenting and liking. It really helps the channel. It helps me too, because it makes me feel like I'm talking to somebody other than myself when I make these. So what I decided is that I'm going to try something different, something I haven't done before. I'm still going to look at an article. This is something that I found on my phone and I sent it to myself, and I haven't read it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of just read this brand new and react to what I think about it. And this is from theguardian.com, and it's titled Carbon Capture Moonshoot Moves Closer as Billions of Dollars Pour In. And before I get started, I would just like to kind of say, first of all, I'm not an expert on any of this stuff. I just like to talk about it, just more spurring a debate and getting other people's opinions and kind of just getting everyone to think about what's going on rather than just ignore it. Or maybe you think it's a certain way and you're stuck on that, but this is a good way to kind of stir up the pot a little bit, if you will. And that I like to do that. So the way I think about carbon capture or sequestration is that it's something that we have to do if we want to survive as a species. At this point where we're at in climate change, just changing how much greenhouse gases we put into the atmosphere isn't going to slow climate change down fast enough, or maybe at all, because the earth is already in feedback loops, positive feedback loops, where if we stopped emitting greenhouse gases, we stopped driving cars, we stopped all of that stuff, transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, if we stopped all of that stuff, the earth has already began releasing greenhouse gases of its own in quantities way larger than what humans put out, to the point where we have to reverse that. We have to take the carbon out of the atmosphere. That's just my personal opinion. If we don't want to roast, then we need to take it out of the air somehow. I don't really know where my opinion lies in terms of how we do that. You could use plants, trees, forests, that kind of stuff. The ocean is a huge carbon capture with reefs and that kind of stuff. And then, of course, you could just literally take it out of the atmosphere somehow. I suppose they know how to do that, and store it underground or in mountains. I think there's even a way where you can take it out of the atmosphere and it like turns into rocks. Breakfast! Somehow you like add a chemical to it or something and it actually turns back into rocks. So there's lots of ways that you can take greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. I don't really think that's the argument. So let's get into this article and see what they have to say. While some say CO2 capture is part of the problem, big projects are being invested in as part solution to the climate crisis. So already right here, this is kind of alluding to that some say CO2 capture is part of the problem. Well, okay, so we've got some pros and cons already. As the world dices with climate emergency, businesses and governments are starting to push funding towards technology that aims to trap planet heating gases rather than let them saturate the atmosphere. Okay, so that's what I was saying. This needs to be done, period. We're at the point where you have to do this now. It says carbon capture is a controversial idea, attacked as a costly distraction from stopping emissions occurring in the first place. Okay, so I guess this is one of the arguments against carbon capture, is that it's expensive, number one, and number two, it's a distraction from actually stopping emissions. So that's what I mean. Not only do we have to remove it from the atmosphere, but we also have to stop putting it out in the quantities that we're putting it out. So last month, the International Energy Agency said it was imperative part of the mix, warning that it would be virtually impossible for the world to hit climate targets without capturing and storing emissions generated from factories, power plants, transportation, and other sources. So, like I said, but what's interesting is I noticed that they don't mention from positive feedback loops as well.
You stupid.
They're not.
Scientists still aren't talking about positive feedback loops. I think that's a mistake. And it says it would be virtually impossible to meet any sort of climate warming goals if we don't start removing things from the atmosphere. So like I said, I'm not an expert, but it kind of sounds like we're on the same page here. The transition to renewable energy, such as solar and wind, would not cut emissions in time. I mean, even fusion probably won't. We were talking about that and how it's going to be 5 years just until they come up with a prototype. And yeah, I think there's been some in the United Kingdom that have actually made plasma, but you have to understand these things are making plasma with power input from carbon emitting sources. They're not producing their own energy yet. So yeah, we've made plasma and apparently can contain a small amount of it. Now we need to move to the next step. That's still 10 years away. 5 if you know you're super lucky, but it's looking like 10 years or longer until we can contain fusion on a scale where it actually could replace fuel, oil, and that type of stuff, natural gas. So, in an eye catching recent deal, a consortium including Amazon and Microsoft invested in CarbonCure Technologies. Now, that's another thing that just has to happen regardless. If we want to tackle climate change, lots of money has to be invested in it, period. Policy has to be changed. We have to move in that direction as a civilization because it can't even just be one culture. I mean, it has to be the entire planet moving towards that goal. So that's another hurdle to overcome. But at this point, some of the most profitable businesses and people are starting to pour money into this because I think it's becoming more apparent that we've been asleep at the wheel here thinking that it's, oh, it's down the road, it's our grandchildren that are going to suffer, and we're starting to see like, oh, it might be us.
Daniel.
Okay, so it says that producing cement is the key ingredient in concrete and creates so much CO2 that if the industry were a country, only China and the US would emit more over the course of a year. So basically what they're saying is there's a lot of carbon dioxide coming from concrete, the manufacturing of concrete. And I mean, you can even take that further. What are you doing with concrete? Well, you're building stuff. So you're transporting all this concrete around. It's heavy. You're having to mix it. You're having to lay it. You're having to use all this major equipment to build this concrete structure. So that all emits CO2 as well. Now, CarbonCure works with nearly 300 concrete producers to inject captured CO2 into their product. So yeah, this is kind of like the idea with putting it into rocks. You can actually take the carbon and you can inject it into the cement, and then you use the cement to build things, and the carbon is then captured in the cement. So that does take some of the carbon emissions out of concrete, but you also have to consider everything else that goes into concrete. Not only that, but everything that would go into capturing CO2. I don't really know. Is it free? Is it free energy to capture CO2 and then put it into concrete? That's probably going to take carbon emissions to do that. The injected gas chemically transforms into limestone, reinforcing the concrete. Okay, great. Well, the reason why this is actually picking up speed or getting traction is because Amazon will use it in its buildings. And so they're going to find profit from it. They're hoping that their investment here is going to reap a reward. In my opinion, I think that's kind of one of the biggest counter arguments to carbon capture is the cost. And why would anybody be motivated to pay all this money to just bring emissions down by removing carbon from the atmosphere if they're not going to benefit from it? Because let's just be real. How many people are actually going to do it because that's what's good for the planet? That's what's good for the species.
The point is, ladies and gentlemen, that greed, for lack of a better word, is good.
Very few. Currently, Carbon Cure is injecting CO2 normally used in products such as carbonated drinks, but hopes to close the loop by capturing it from cement production in order to reduce global concrete emissions by 500 million metric tons by the end of the decade. I don't really even know what this number means. It doesn't really sound like that much, to be honest with you. The funding from Amazon will be critical to rapidly scale up the solution we've developed. Now, what that means is that this is just part of a solution. This is definitely not the cure-all. Now, what they said is to make a significant dent in pollution, emissions from concrete will have to be captured, or new non-concrete materials will need to be used on a vast scale, even as countries such as China and India rapidly build new infrastructure. So, I mean, you're talking about 500 million metric tons that it'll take out by the end of the decade. How many million metric tons is it putting out right now as it's being used? And it's being used in China and India, who are rapidly building new infrastructure. So they have to start doing that right now. And it really says it'll have to be used on a vast scale. New non-concrete materials. That's what we should be looking into. And I guess the reasoning behind this is you can't just flip a switch. So as we still use concrete, which we shouldn't be using it at all, we should be using non-concrete materials. I mean, science is coming up with all this stuff, but they can't come up with something other than concrete. Well, it's not that science can't come up with it. It's that industry can't make it profitable for them. Is that possible? Absolutely. Will it be challenging? You bet. This is that optimism, that positive thinking that we can do what we need to avert complete disaster.
He needs some milk.
But it's a gamble. No, the guy's name is Gamble. And he says the prospects for capturing carbon from concrete production will be challenging. This investment is one that indicates a huge amount of optimism and what is possible. So here we go. The next sentence is talking about optimism. That's great. We need to have optimism, but we also need to be real about it. A lot of times people say, oh, well, you can't just use fear tactics only when it comes to climate change. As a matter of fact, that's the worst thing you can do. Well, fear should motivate you.
Do it! Just do it!
This broad sweep of technology can be split roughly into two types: air conditioner-like machines that can suck CO2 directly from the air, and infrastructure that captures emissions at source and stores them, usually underground. Okay, this is great. So now we're actually talking about carbon capture. Air conditioner-like machines that can suck CO2 directly from the air. Well, now I want to know, how much energy does it take to run these things? How much energy does it take to make them? And infrastructure that captures emissions at the source and stores them, usually underground. This seems like it would be probably more cost effective, and it's a preventative measure instead of a reactive measure like sucking it out. But you still have to provide this infrastructure, this technology, and upgrade everything. That costs money. It takes airplanes to ship all this stuff. I mean, it still takes carbon emissions to make all this happen. And so what we're thinking is, oh, well, we've got years and years and years. We don't have to do this until 2050. So we could easily switch all this over by 2050. And the emissions that we put out doing it, we can suck back in from with air conditioners and these, emission capturing sources. Well, my personal opinion is we got till about 2030 before it's like red alert, beeping alarm, and there's no turning back. Carbon capture is still in its infancy. So there's another great piece of news. It's still in its infancy. That means it's not highly advanced, ready to go. Let's just unleash it right now. There are only about 20 projects in commercial use worldwide. but billions of dollars in investment is flowing. So here we go. We've got money again coming in. Great. It'll start to expand. Seems like Microsoft is kind of heading this up. So, you know, maybe it's the Illuminati. But they're putting a lot of money into trying to fix climate change. And it's called Moonshoot. It's a climate plan put forth by Microsoft that will involve direct air capture of CO2 and biomass energy carbon capture and storage, where wood chips are burned and the resulted carbon is injected into rock formations. There we go. Now they're creating rocks. I'm most interested in biomass energy personally, especially as it pertains to capturing CO2 and turning it into biomass. And then if you could use that biomass to power things, you could have a net zero if you could do that correctly. Norway is launching a full-scale carbon capture and storage project. The storage projects are interesting, but at the moment, I think the biggest argument is they just cost a lot. And then what do you pay for storage? So how do they turn this model into a business model that makes money? I think is going to be the next step in storing CO2 that's removed from the atmosphere. But now you've got to think, where are you storing this? Is it underground? What do you have to do to create those storages? You're using heavy equipment. You're using carbon. You're emitting carbon to even create the storage projects. While a direct air capture project for the Permian Basin in the southwestern U.S. is doubling in size and aims to suck up 1 million tons of CO2 a year. That sounds pretty decent, but I don't really know how much gets put out there. I can imagine the melting ice puts out way more than 1 million tons a year. The U.S. government is pitching in, recently awarding 72 million. So now the government's starting to get involved. This is when you know that it's really moving forward, like it's serious. The government is now investing, and that means policy is changing. The people who make decisions on laws and what we're going to do, what we're going to spend our money on, are now saying we need to start figuring out how to capture carbon. That just goes to show me that this is a pretty serious option. It says we are at a tipping point and no one knows quite how it will tip. This is my favorite part of this whole subject. So excuse me if I'm a pessimist, but no one knows quite how it will tip or when it will tip or what the actual breaking point is. We may have already crossed that. There's all this unknown in the scientific community. So you can't sit there and say, oh, this is all scientific and that's conjecture. Well, the science is still conjecture at this point. Now, there's things like mechanical trees that remove CO2 from the air. And he says, even with all this stuff, the world is likely to surge beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius global heating limit. We are living in an overshoot world where 1.C will be missed. I mean, it's going to be missed by a long shot. We are going to have to step harder on the brakes and we're going to have to get carbon back. I mean, stepping on the brakes is an understatement. That should be an afterthought. We should be doing it. We should have a handbrake pulled up. But the real thing we need to focus on is getting the carbon out of the atmosphere, like now. But many environmentalists are not keen on the idea. So, wow, this sounds counterintuitive to me, that environmentalists don't want us to take the carbon out of the atmosphere. I wonder why. It says environmentalists are not keen on an idea that would burnish the green credentials of fossil fuel companies by installing carbon capture okay, so what I'm understanding from this is that they're complaining that we'll just keep on doing what we're doing if we could just take it out of the atmosphere.
21.
Okay, great. If we can take it out of the atmosphere way faster than we can put it into the atmosphere, then we're reversing climate change. We could deal with all this stuff later. Carbon capture technology can trap and store carbon emissions. So here's just a little chart. I'm going to leave this link in the description as always. You can take a look at this stuff. Basically, you've got the, carbon producing entity here. All the emissions come out. It goes into this little system. There's a solvent, there's heat, and it's captured. I don't know. Are you planning on running all this stuff off of wind and solar? Because it sounds like there's chemicals and stuff involved. Hopefully it's just a closed loop and you don't have to keep putting more chemicals in. Where are you getting those chemicals from? How are you mining those chemicals or creating those chemicals? Those are all things that go into carbon emissions. I think that's a huge misnomer. People just think cars or agriculture or whatever, but you got to think about forest fires. You got to think about producing things, moving things, even putting this whole system on here. This takes energy and resources to do. Lackner said that retrofitting aging zombie power plants with carbon capture units was often pointless. Well, yeah, I mean, it is pointless. I'm assuming based on cost, it's pointless if you could just switch to renewables, but it says renewables are waiting in the wings to replace fossil fuels. Okay, well, it takes energy to create solar panels and to create solar panel arrays and to do all this connecting of renewable energy, electricity, and whatnot. The technology should instead be used, he said, for stubbornly persistent pollution coming from shipping, aviation, and trucks that could not easily be removed by the shift to cleaner energy. Yeah, so that's why you have to suck it out of the air. Scaling up is the issue, and so it needs investment and it needs regulation. I mean, this is in its infancy. We're not even talking about if they wanted to in 2 years, they could have this all up and running and sucking out enough carbon out of the atmosphere that it would make a difference in comparison to the soil that's releasing it, to the ice that's releasing it, to agriculture, which it doesn't even address here, not yet. Lackner said the industrial capacity for widespread carbon capture exists, but it requires political will. But here's something that points back to history, where there was a point when we needed to do something like fix sewage because it was leading to disease and that kind of stuff, and we did it. But I can't really say in my mind that tackling a sewage issue back in the 18th century was nearly as daunting a task as trying to reverse climate change. There's going to be irreversible harm. Species are going to go extinct, probably humans as well. Seas will rise and we won't be able to unmelt glaciers. We will get there. The question is, how much collateral damage will we do on the way?
Allahu Akbar!
No, the question is, how fast is that coming? So I guess that's this article. That was a pretty good article about carbon capture. This is just kind of one way to capture carbon. Well, it was about 2 ways, but in terms of removing it with, electronic devices like air conditioner type things, and then storing it in the ground or capturing it at the source, that's only one piece of carbon capture. But this seems to be what we're aiming for at the moment. And I'm going to give this one a foul ball.
These nuts.
I don't think it's a strikeout. So we've got 2 strikes. I'll give this one a foul ball, mostly just so we can continue kind of exploring what climate change has in store for us. But so the count is 2 strikes, 1 ball.
Got it.
And I think next probably I would like to talk about food, maybe also talk about mass die-offs, things like that. But we'll see. And I'm going to continue on making videos when I can. They might not come out every day or as often as they were, but I'm going to keep the ball rolling and hopefully get into some other projects here. Maybe I can start doing podcasts on Edge of Discord. So if we start doing that, I'll definitely link that stuff in my videos so you guys can check it out if you're interested in listening to me and Andrew kind of babble on. And actually, I think that channel will probably take the brunt of politics and economy. And so there's some changes coming to Edge of Discord if any of you are already following us over there, and keep checking back because we've got some things in the making over there. Other than that, I hope everybody's having a good day. Hope you're all staying sane. This election stuff is driving me nuts. I'm just sitting back with my popcorn and my whiskey, kind of watching it unfold. I'm waiting until January 20th before I try to wrap my head around it at all, because there's just so many things that can happen between now and then. And if it comes down to it, I also have stockpiling bullets. So we'll see what comes of this. And Hope everybody has a good one. We'll talk to you later.